Golda Meir, often called the Iron Lady, was seriously surprising. She secretly fought leukemia for 15 years while she was, at the same time, leading Israel through a fight for survival. Publicly, she totally played the role of a sweet, simple grandma who'd offer you tea and cake, a complete act. After the terrible Munich massacre, she was absolutely furious. This socialist leader personally gave the green light for a secret, dangerous mission to hunt down everyone responsible. She had huge power, making life-and-death decisions that seriously impacted the whole world. But 1973 was her biggest, most defining moment. Even with warnings about an attack, she made the incredibly tough call to wait for international support instead of striking first. On the holiest day, the Yom Kippur War exploded, and it almost wiped the country out. It still makes you wonder, how do you celebrate a victory that comes with such a massive feeling of guilt? Golda Meir's story doesn't start in fancy government offices or crazy war rooms. It starts in the cold, scary streets of Kiev, Ukraine, back in the late 1800s. To really get the Iron Lady, you have to picture a 4-year-old girl hiding in a basement while her dad nailed boards over the windows to protect them from an angry mob, a Tsarist pogrom. That first memory of being helpless and the raw fear of being hunted just for being Jewish became the foundation of who she was. It wasn't just a detail in her life. It was the spark for a crazy strong determination that would later decide the fate of millions. Golda's entire journey came from realizing that for her people, surviving wasn't a guarantee, it was something they had to fight for with everything they had. This early experience with how fragile Jewish life was outside of a homeland made her deeply distrust outside help and fiercely believe in doing things yourself. When she moved from the shadows of Eastern Europe to the opportunities in Milwaukee, that Kiev basement memory stayed with her. It turned a scared kid into a woman who would spend her whole life making sure no Jewish child ever felt that particular kind of terror again. America offered her safety, but she found the comfort of the West wasn't enough. The socialist ideas she found there gave her a way to express her restlessness, but they didn't offer a physical place to go. She realized that just talking about it wouldn't protect her people, leading her straight to the growing Zionist movement. This meant trading the easygoing American dream for the super harsh, unyielding reality of a desert outpost. She understood that the only way to break the cycle of being a victim was to build her own fortress, a sovereign place where Jews weren't just guests at someone else's mercy. This wasn't some intellectual thought experiment. It was a deep, burning need that drove her to leave a pretty comfortable American life for a mission most people thought was totally nuts. Before we jump deeper into how this pioneer changed and how her nation survived, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support is huge and lets us keep researching these powerful stories of human resilience. Don't forget to click the notification bell and share this video with other history fans. Now let's head back to Mandatory Palestine and see how Golda Meir started building a country from scratch. When Golda Meir got to Mandatory Palestine in 1921, she wasn't met with the beautiful, promised land you read about. She was hit with the grueling, sun-baked reality of Kibbutz Merhavia in the Jezreel Valley. For someone who grew up in urban Milwaukee, the transition was a huge shock, the kind that would have broken most people's spirit. She didn't arrive as some VIP, politician, or smarty pants. She arrived as a regular laborer, determined to prove that the Zionist dream was built not on lofty speeches in European fancy places, but on the calloused hands and aching backs of its people. The original kibbutz members were initially skeptical of this American girl, doubting her ability to handle the tough physical work of communal farming and the malaria-ridden swamps. Golda's answer was to simply outwork everyone, driven by stubborn pride and a deep need to belong to the land. She threw herself into the most basic and exhausting chores, planting trees in rocky, unforgiving soil, picking crops under a brutal, dehydrating sun, and running the communal kitchen with strict fairness. She famously insisted on washing clothes by hand and refused any special treatment, seeing physical labor as a kind of secular prayer and the purest expression of her socialist beliefs. This time was crucial in shaping her leadership style. It taught her that respect and authority are earned by going through shared sacrifice, not just by having a title. At the kibbutz, she mastered the art of managing people in a tiny society, balancing the community's desperate needs with the harsh, often lethal limitations of their environment. She wasn't just building a farm, she was essentially building a prototype nation, testing the limits of human endurance and sticking together. The dirt under her nails, the scars on her hands, and the constant exhaustion were like badges of honor. They gave her the moral right to later demand similar, and even greater, sacrifices from an entire country during its toughest times. The year 1948 was the ultimate cliffhanger for the Jewish people, a moment where the dream of a sovereign state was mere hours away from either a miracle birth or total, violent annihilation. In this suffocating atmosphere of tension and impending doom, Golda Meir took on one of the most daring and dangerous missions in modern diplomatic history. It reads more like a spy movie than a diplomatic record. Disguising herself as an Arab woman to fit into the chaotic landscape, she crossed the volatile, heavily guarded border into Jordan for a secret, late-night meeting with King Abdullah I. The stakes were absolute. The survival of the soon-to-be state of Israel depended on whether she could convince the king to stay neutral in the coming conflict and leave the Arab coalition. Just imagine the scene. A woman who would soon be a world leader, shrouded in traditional robes, traveling through hostile territory where being discovered meant instant death, all to take a desperate gamble for peace. During the meeting, Abdullah, perhaps impressed by her sheer nerve, reportedly asked her why she was in such a rush to proclaim a state, suggesting they wait for a better time. Golda, with the bluntness that became her signature, famously shot back that the Jewish people had already waited 2,000 years and their patience had simply run out. Though the meeting ultimately failed to stop Jordan from entering the war, it showed the incredible depths of Golda's physical and moral courage. It was a masterclass in high-stakes diplomacy conducted in the shadows of war, proving to the male-dominated leadership that she had nerves of steel and was willing to put her own life on the line for the collective security of her people. This secret journey wasn't just a mission of statecraft, it was a personal testament to her belief that no distance was too far, no disguise too embarrassing, and no risk too great when Israel's existence was on the line. On May 14, 1948, as David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence in the crowded Tel Aviv Museum, Golda Meir sat among the signers, her eyes welling up with tears as she realized the massive importance of the moment. She was one of only 2 women to sign that historic document, her signature representing the culmination of centuries of hope, suffering, and struggle. However, there was zero time for celebration or reflection. The new state was immediately attacked by 5 Arab armies, and it had none of the weapons, ammo, or funds to defend itself against the overwhelming odds. Ben-Gurion looked to Golda and gave her what many thought was an impossible, almost suicidal task: go to America immediately and raise the astronomical amount of money needed to buy the arms for survival. She left within hours, arriving in the United States with only the simple, worn clothes she was wearing and a suitcase full of raw determination. Speaking to the Jewish community in cities across the country, she didn't use flowery language or academic theories. She spoke with the raw, urgent, and heartbreaking honesty of a woman whose home and people were under direct fire. She told her audiences that the Jews in Israel would fight with their bare hands if they had to, but that they shouldn't have to die just because they lacked the tools to defend themselves. The response was totally unprecedented in the history of philanthropy. In just a few weeks, she raised over $50 million, a staggering, almost unimaginable sum at the time that surpassed even the most optimistic leaders' expectations. Ben-Gurion would later say, with rare emotion, that Golda was the woman who got the money which made the state possible. Those funds bought the crucial Czech rifles, heavy machinery, and Messerschmitt planes that allowed the fledgling Israel Defense Forces to hold the line against the invasion. This period totally cemented her reputation as a formidable, unstoppable force on the international stage. She proved she could move the hearts of thousands and open the wallets of the wealthy, serving as the vital, life-saving bridge between the struggling pioneers in the desert and the influential, affluent Jewish community in the West. After the War of Independence ended, Golda Meir was named Israel's first Minister of Labor, a role many might have seen as less important than defense or foreign policy, but which she viewed as the very soul and moral heart of the Zionist project. The young nation was suddenly flooded with hundreds of thousands of immigrants, many of them skeletal Holocaust survivors or destitute refugees kicked out of Arab lands, who arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a lifetime of trauma. They were living in tents, in squalid, mud-clogged transit camps called mabarat, exposed to freezing winter rains and lacking even the most basic human dignity. Golda saw this not just as a logistical or economic problem, but as a deep moral crisis that threatened the state's legitimacy. She became the main architect of the nation's human infrastructure, launching massive, unprecedented public works projects to build permanent housing, roads, and schools for these new citizens. She famously walked through the deep mud of the transit camps, talking directly to the mothers and children in their own languages, promising them that the state would not abandon them and would provide a roof over their heads. Her philosophy was deceptively simple. A country's strength wasn't just measured by its borders or its army, but by its social contract and how it cared for its most vulnerable members. She pushed through landmark laws for national insurance, maternity leave, and workers' rights, creating a social safety net that was incredibly progressive for such a young and poor country. Her cabinet colleagues, often hardened military men or career politicians, were frequently awestruck by her tenacity and her ability to navigate the complex, often broken bureaucracy to get things done. It was during this time that Ben-Gurion famously called her the only man in my cabinet, a backhanded, era-specific compliment that reflected her unrivaled competence, her directness, and her absolute refusal to be intimidated by the male-dominated political establishment. In 1956, Golda Meir became the foreign minister, a role she held with distinction for nearly a decade, during which she fundamentally reshaped Israel's standing and perception globally. Navigating the tricky, shifting waters of the Cold War, she realized that Israel couldn't survive in a bubble of isolation. She launched a groundbreaking and highly unconventional diplomatic offensive, focusing especially on the newly independent nations of Africa that were emerging from colonialism. Golda believed that Israel, as a young state that had successfully modernized its agriculture, water management, and infrastructure quickly, had a unique opportunity and responsibility to share its knowledge with other developing nations. Under her visionary leadership, the MASAF program was created, sending thousands of Israeli experts in irrigation, healthcare, and education to dozens of African and Asian countries. This soft power initiative was a brilliant strategic move to build international alliances and break the diplomatic and economic siege imposed by Israel's neighbors. She was often seen in African villages, wearing her simple dresses, discussing poultry farming or water conservation with local leaders, projecting an image of Israel that was deeply rooted in the socialist ideals of global cooperation and mutual aid. At the same time, she worked tirelessly to strengthen the special relationship with the United States, cultivating deep personal ties with leaders like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon V. Johnson. Golda presented a new face for Israel, not just a country under constant siege, but a vibrant, industrious democracy that was a valuable and reliable partner in global progress. She was a master of the personal touch, often hosting foreign dignitaries in her own modest home and serving them coffee and cake, blending her maternal, grandmotherly persona with a sharp, uncompromising, and often intimidating defense of Israeli national interests. The year 1969 brought a massive and unexpected change in Israeli politics after the sudden, tragic death of Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. At 71 years old, Golda Meir had already retired from active political life, having survived a long career and starting her secret battle with leukemia. Yet, The Labour Party turned to her as the only figure with enough respect and authority to keep the divided coalition together during a period of national mourning and geopolitical uncertainty. She didn't seek the premiership. She accepted it with a sense of grim, stoic duty, stepping into the role of the world's third female prime minister at a time when such a thing was almost unheard of. At the time, Israel was in a dangerous state of near-blind euphoria, still riding the high of the miraculous, lightning-fast victory of the 1967 Six-Day War. The nation felt militarily unbeatable, protected by the Bar-Lev line along the Suez Canal and a military establishment that arrogantly believed the Arab states would never dare to attack again. Golda inherited this atmosphere of overconfidence, which history would later call the concepция, the fixed idea that war was a distant impossibility. Her leadership style as prime minister was famously informal yet deeply authoritative. She often bypassed the traditional, formal cabinet meetings, instead holding the most crucial national security and strategy sessions in the cramped kitchen of her modest home in Jerusalem. This kitchen cabinet, where generals and ministers gathered around her table for tea, cake, and heavy cigarette smoke, became the unofficial but absolute nerve center of the Israeli government. To the public, she was the bub or grandmother of the nation, a comforting and familiar figure, but behind closed doors, she was a fierce, demanding, and often relentless leader who didn't tolerate dissent and expected total loyalty. The world's perception of Golda Meir's maternal image was totally shattered in the summer of 1972 when the Munich Olympics ended in the brutal, televised massacre of 11 Israeli athletes and coaches by the Palestinian terrorist group Black September. For Golda, this wasn't just a political crisis or a security failure, it was a deeply personal violation of the sanctuary she had spent her entire life building for the Jewish people. The sight of Jewish athletes being bound, tortured, and murdered on German soil, the very land of the Holocaust, ignited a cold, burning, and calculated rage within her soul. While the world offered empty condolences and diplomatic niceties, Golda demanded a tangible and lethal form of justice. She authorized Operation Wrath of God, a top-secret, years-long campaign by the Mossad to track down and eliminate every single person involved in planning and executing the Munich massacre. This was a radical and controversial break from traditional state behavior, a clear and uncompromising signal that the State of Israel would no longer rely on international law or foreign governments to protect its citizens abroad. Golda took the heavy weight of these decisions personally, reportedly reviewing the intelligence files and evidence against each target before personally giving the green light for their elimination. She understood the immense moral, ethical, and legal risks, but her priority was singular and clear: to create a deterrent so powerful and so terrifying that the cost of spilling Israeli blood would be seen as prohibitive and final. This operation lasted for years, haunting the shadows of Europe and the Middle East, and it solidified Golda's global reputation as a leader who was prepared to use the full, lethal, and extrajudicial power of the state to avenge her people. The autumn of 1973 would become the ultimate test where Golda Meir's legacy was forged and nearly broken beyond repair. In the weeks leading up to Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, intelligence reports started pouring into her office, detailing massive, unprecedented Egyptian and Syrian troop movements along the borders. However, Israeli military intelligence and her senior advisors, still blinded by the concepция, dismissed these as just seasonal exercises or empty threats. Golda, with her gut feeling for danger honed in the basements of Kiev, felt a growing, suffocating unease that her generals couldn't soothe with their technical assurances. She found herself caught in an agonizing, historic dilemma: to launch a massive preemptive strike, as Israel had successfully done in 1967, or to wait for definitive proof of an attack to ensure international support and legitimacy. Her military advisors and the Americans warned that a preemptive strike would alienate the United States and deprive Israel of vital diplomatic and military support in the long run. Golda, remembering the total isolation and abandonment of 1948, made the fateful, haunting decision to wait. On October 6, 1973, as the nation fasted and prayed, the silence was shattered as Egypt and Syria launched a massive, coordinated surprise attack on two fronts. The first 48 hours were a literal hell on earth. The Bar-Lev line fell within hours, the Golan Heights were being overrun by hundreds of Syrian tanks, and the very existence of the State of Israel seemed to hang by a single, fraying thread. In the privacy of her office, chain-smoking one cigarette after another, and surviving on nothing but black coffee, Golda faced the unthinkable prospect of total national annihilation. She contemplated the use of Israel's ultimate deterrent, yet she remained remarkably stoic in public, providing a calm, steady, and resolute face to a terrified and reeling nation. Amidst the chaos, confusion, and mounting casualties of the Yom Kippur War, Golda Meir's seasoned diplomatic skill became Israel's ultimate and only lifeline. With the military running dangerously low on ammunition, tanks, and aircraft, she bypassed the usual bureaucratic channels and made a direct, desperate, and deeply emotional appeal to U.S. President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. She famously told Kissinger that this is not just another war, it is the survival of Israel and the Jewish people. Her raw, unvarnished plea, combined with the strategic necessity of keeping a Soviet-backed offensive in check during the height of the Cold War, resulted in Operation Nickel Grass, a massive, around-the-clock American airlift of weapons and supplies that directly turned the tide of the conflict. While the Israeli Defense Forces eventually regained their footing through sheer heroism and desperation, pushing across the Suez Canal and within striking distance of Damascus, the victory was hollow and anything but celebratory. Over 2,600 Israeli soldiers had died in just 3 weeks, and thousands more were left with permanent scars. The myth of Israeli invincibility and the infallibility of its leadership had been permanently and violently shattered. Golda had secured the military victory through her diplomatic grit, but she had lost the psychological war for the heart of the nation. Even as the ceasefire was signed, the country was in a state of profound mourning, and the public's anger toward the government was beginning to boil over into the streets. Golda had stayed the course and kept the country together during its most vulnerable moments since 1948, but the cost of that survival was etched into every new, weary line on her face. The aftermath of the war brought a bitter, public, and relentlessly painful reckoning for the Israeli leadership. The Agranat Commission was set up to investigate the intelligence failures and the lack of preparedness that had led to the surprise attack. While the Commission's final report eventually cleared Golda of direct personal or operational responsibility, placing the primary blame on the military intelligence apparatus and the Chief of Staff, the political climate in Israel had become irrevocably toxic. A grieving, disillusioned, and angry public, led by returning war veterans and the families of the fallen, took to the streets in massive protests, demanding that the Meir-Dayan government take moral and political responsibility for the Mechtel, or the blunder. Golda, who had always seen her leadership as a sacred form of service to her people, was deeply and permanently wounded by the accusations that she had been negligent or had blood on her hands. She felt the pain of every lost soldier as if they were her own child. Despite winning the subsequent national election in late 1973, she realized with a heavy heart that she could no longer effectively lead a nation that had lost its fundamental faith in its founding pioneers. In April 1974, she announced her resignation to a shocked cabinet. She left office not as a defeated politician in the traditional sense, but as a weary, exhausted mother who felt she had stayed too long at the table and that it was time for a new generation to take over. Her departure marked the symbolic end of an era, the era of the giants who had built the state from the desert sands and the ashes of the Holocaust. Even in her resignation, she remained a figure of immense moral authority, but the trauma, the guilt, and the what-ifs of the Yom Kippur War would haunt her every waking moment for the rest of her days. In the final, quiet years of her life, Golda Meir fought a private battle that was as grueling and exhausting as any she had faced in the political arena, yet she did so with a dignity and secrecy that was truly remarkable. For over 15 years, including the entire time she was prime minister, she had been suffering from leukemia, a fact known only to her closest family and a few medical professionals. Every few weeks, she would slip away from her office or her home to a hospital under the cover of night for agonizing treatments, returning to her desk the next morning to manage the affairs of state as if nothing had happened. This incredible feat of physical and mental endurance was the ultimate, final testament to her stoicism and her belief that a leader must never show weakness. She refused to let her illness define her or to appear as anything less than the Iron Lady the nation required. She lived her final years in a modest, unassuming apartment, surrounded by her beloved books, her family, and the memories of a life that had spanned the most turbulent, tragic, and triumphant century in Jewish history. When she finally passed away in December 1978, the nation of Israel, and indeed the entire world, stopped to mourn a woman who had become a global symbol of Jewish resilience and female empowerment. Her funeral was attended by presidents, kings, and world leaders, but the most poignant and meaningful tributes came from the ordinary citizens, the kibbutzniks she had worked with, the soldiers she had sent to war, and the immigrants she had built homes for who saw her not just as a prime minister, but as Golda, one of their own. Golda Meir remains, decades after her death, a deeply polarizing and fascinating figure in modern history. To her fans, she is the indomitable grandmother of the nation, the woman who built Israel's social system, secured its physical survival through sheer diplomatic grit, and stood as a steady beacon of strength during its most terrifying hours. They point to her pioneering role as a female leader in a fiercely male-dominated era and her unwavering, lifelong commitment to the socialist ideals of equality and labor. To her critics, however, she is the leader whose perceived stubbornness and reliance on an arrogant military establishment nearly led to the total destruction of the state in 1973. They argue that her initial dismissal of a distinct Palestinian national identity and her hardline stance on territorial issues contributed to the long-term, seemingly unbreakable cycle of conflict in the region. Yet, regardless of your political viewpoint, it is impossible to deny the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of her impact on the 20th century. She was a woman of immense contradictions, a socialist who lived simply but wielded the power of life and death, a grandmother who served tea and cake to generals while simultaneously authorizing top-secret assassinations, and a leader who was both deeply loved as a maternal figure and fiercely blamed for the nation's trauma. Her story is, in many ways, the story of Israel itself, born in the fires of trauma, built through immense individual and collective sacrifice, and constantly grappling with the impossible, heavy weight of its own survival in a hostile world. Beyond the grand political battles and the high-stakes military crises, Golda Meir's personal life was a quiet testament to the profound sacrifices required of those who choose to lead. She often spoke, with a rare and heartbreaking vulnerability, of the deep guilt she felt as a mother, constantly trying to balance the needs of her children with the relentless, 24-hour demands of a nation that seemed to require her every waking moment and every ounce of her energy. This internal conflict between her maternal instincts and her national duty was a constant, painful companion throughout her long career, yet she never allowed it to derail her commitment to the Zionist cause. She was a woman of remarkably simple tastes, preferring the company of her family and the quiet comfort of her home to the opulence, ceremony, and grandiosity of high office. Her ability to remain deeply grounded and connected to the common person, even as she navigated the highest and most complex levels of global power, was perhaps her most enduring and endearing quality. She was a leader who fundamentally understood the value of hard work, the necessity of community, and the importance of staying true to one's roots, values that had been forged and hardened in the crucible of her early life in Kiev and Milwaukee. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that leadership is not just about the technicalities of making decisions. It is about the core character, the lived experience, and the fundamental values that inform those decisions in the heat of a crisis. As we look back on the long, storied life, and the complex legacy of Golda Meir, we see a woman who was truly and undeniably larger than life. She was a pioneer, a stateswoman, a warrior, and a symbol of hope for a people who had long been without a home and a voice. Her journey was one of constant struggle, immense achievement, and profound tragedy, a journey that perfectly mirrors the modern history of the state she helped build from nothing. From the terrified streets of Kiev to the halls of power in Jerusalem and the podium of the United Nations, Golda Meir remained unshakably true to herself and her people. She was a woman of iron will and deep, often hidden compassion, a leader who was prepared to make the ultimate personal and political sacrifices for the cause she believed in with every fiber of her being. Her life is a lasting testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome the most insurmountable odds and the enduring legacy of those who are willing to fight, day after day, for what they believe is right. Golda Meir will forever be remembered as one of the most influential and consequential figures of the 20th century, a woman who helped shape the destiny of a nation and the identity of a people. Her name will always be synonymous with the struggle for Jewish sovereignty, the resilience of the human spirit in the face of total adversity, and the uncompromising pursuit of a dream that changed the world forever.